Welcome to the Trump 100 question and answer, the Q&A. I'm James Matthews.
I'm Martha Kelner.
It's been a busy week, Martha.
It
for
has.
You.
It has. It's been a big story, really, hasn't
Yeah.
it? I'm obviously rarely in DC. Arrived here from LA on Monday. I'd barely taken my coat off before we had this Atlantic magazine story breaking, which has just shaped the whole week.
Biggest story of the Trump presidency so far, isn't it?
Biggest challenge for them, biggest crisis, certainly, and one that's not going away anytime soon. It's still the biggest story around.
Yeah, and Marjorie Taylor Greene. We'll get to that, all right, in due course. But thanks very much for your questions. There's been a few of them.
Yeah, there has. We'll kick off, James, with a question from Peter Collins. He wants to know, what do ordinary Americans make of Donald Trump's first 3 months in office?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Well, I went out to Caroline County, the cradle of horse racing, they call it. Not that we saw many horses, I have to say, and actually not many people. Real small-town America, Main Street, with very few people, actually. It came alive at lunchtime, happily, so, we were able to kind of gauge the opinion. This is a place that voted Donald Trump in, voted Republican at the election, so the kind of rural heartland, I suppose, that he needed to win, and they delivered for him. The question 2 months in was, well, what do you think? Obviously, there's a lot going on, a lot of change, chaos, arguably, and of course the story at the heart of it all, Signalgate. We had several hours, spoke to maybe 8 people in total. 2 Republicans stood out for me. I mean, the Democrats weren't happy. Yeah. Actually very concerned, one guy in tears, the way things were shaping up. Robert Heyman, used to be a Democrat, now a Republican. I asked him about Signalgate. And, he gave me an answer that I suppose the Trump administration kind of want to hear. He said, well, you're telling me it's a scandal or suggesting it's a scandal. Actually, there's a lot of sources of information. I've seen stuff on Facebook, and I'm not entirely sure there's that much to it. And in any case, he said, American lives didn't appear to be put at risk.
Maybe that's the Trump strategy working.
Yeah, I think so, Martha. Yeah, the other one was Patty Roberts. She said, I don't own a TV, haven't watched it for a year, so I don't want to comment on that story. And it basically wasn't very interested. But as you say, Martha, how politics lands with people depends on who they support. It depends on where they get their information. And I think this business, and we've spoken about it, of the Trump administration denying, disputing, deflecting everything, it's clearly working with Robert and with Patty. So I think it's early in answer to your question, Peter, but that was the kind of general sense I got from Main Street, small-town America yesterday. Martha, a question from you for you from Kev6. Do you think that Trump tariffs will have a negative effect on US trade in reality?
It's the interesting question, isn't it, at the moment? Aside from Signalgate, Team Trump would rather we focus on tariffs at the moment. They're a huge part of Donald Trump's economic vision. He campaigned...
The most lovely word, he calls it.
Yeah, and he campaigned on this platform of America First, this idea of bringing manufacturing back to the US. That was what we heard him talking about time and again in these rallies. I remember being in Flint, Michigan, a few weeks before the election. That is a place that was, raised by the car manufacturing industry and devastated by its decline. And he was telling people, we're going to bring back jobs here, we're going to bring back manufacturing here, we're going to lower the cost for consumers. That's the plan. And that's all very well if you're an American business owner who exports your goods. The question about where the final economic burden of tariffs fall is much more complicated than that, especially if you're an American business that needs imported goods from one of those countries that has been slapped by these Trump tariffs. So we're talking predominantly about Canada, Mexico and China here. It's not easy for businesses to suddenly just start moving their manufacturing plants back to the US in order to avoid these tariffs. That was Donald Trump's, or is Donald Trump's, long-term vision. But those things take time, they take more money. So who ultimately bears the burden? It's more than America First. If an American business, for example, relies on imported goods from overseas and they decide to pass those tariffs onto the consumer, then clearly what's going to happen is there's going to be raised prices, much higher prices, certainly in the short term. What Donald Trump will try to say is, look, this is short-term pain for long-term gain. But, you know, the economic experts have long been warning that tariffs are not a sound economic way to, you know, manage a country, and that ultimately it is Americans who will pay the price for this.
Yeah, yeah.
We've got a question from Big Martin, all one word, for you, James. He says, is it not time for Britain and the Europeans to hit America where it hurts with massive tariffs, and even hitting their tourist trade with tariffs? The Americans don't like us, so why not get together as one and hit them?
Yeah, well, thanks, Martin. It's a tempting prospect, I suppose, for many, isn't it? Those in particular who feel beaten down by Donald Trump to hit back where it hurts. How realistic that is a different question. I think when we saw Trump introducing 25% tariffs on all cars outside of the United States this week, the UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves, she was quick to say she wouldn't be introducing retaliatory tariffs. Now, the UK government clearly worried about an escalating trade war, and they have been talking a lot about potentially striking up a trade deal with the US ahead of these tariffs coming into force. So watch this space on that one. The Lib Dems, they would agree with you, Martin. I think Deputy Party Leader Daisy Cooper, she said, I think there's only one language that Donald Trump understands, and that is the language of strength. She suggested the UK starts by putting tariffs on Tesla cars. That would certainly be an option to hit Elon Musk where it hurts. But generally, I think there's a lot of worry that more tariffs just puts more and more strain on crucial supply chains. That is an extremely costly business. There is also concern, I suppose, that any severe that word again, retaliatory
It's not your favourite, is it?
action in retaliation on tariffs would anger Donald Trump and put NATO at risk. The UK and Europe are scrambling to figure out their own security as well as Ukraine's potential security. Potentially without the reliable help of the United States.
Yeah.
But they're not there yet. As the US is the most powerful member of NATO, the UK and Europe still really need to keep Donald Trump on side in that arena. Martha, we've got building next door, by the way, which is
we're still under construction.
It's still a work in progress on so many levels. Connor asks, could it really be that Pete Hegseth and that crowd can just control the narrative and brush off the leak like it's nothing? Is there seriously nothing the Democrats can do to push for accountability, change, or even resignations?
I think certainly the plan has been on toughing this out, on trying to distract, take the mind of the American people in other directions. I don't think this story is going away. Like I said earlier, it's still the biggest story in town. Just to take you back to when it first broke, when The Atlantic magazine published that stunning piece online saying, I think the headline was, the Trump administration texts me its war plans. I remember reading it almost, open jaw at some of the content of what was in it. And our editor back at Sky News in London immediately phoned me. She was saying, how big is this? I'm trying to decide where to put it in my running order, how big a story it will be, what the cut through will be.
Well, I suppose for a lot of people, it was, sure, of course. Yeah, we've been living this for 2 months.
Exactly.
It's chaos. Stuff happens every 5 minutes. A war plan in your inbox. Yeah, sure, of course.
Yeah, it is hard to know with this administration because there are so many news stories every day, this idea of flooding the zone. It's hard to know where this sits in the pantheon. And I said, look, I've read it. The detail is extraordinary. We shouldn't just, we should take this seriously. But I said, they will try and ignore it. They'll try and say there are bigger things going on out there. So it's hard to know if it will run and run or not. And we eventually, decided it was a really big story, put it very prominently in the running order. And it quickly became clear that this wasn't going to go away. You had the morning after Tulsi Gabbard, National Intelligence Director, John Ratcliffe, the CIA Director, two of the so-called Signal 18, they were up in front of the Senate committee answering questions. And they didn't quite have their story straight, but they were both saying, this isn't classified information, trying to minimise the importance of the story. Yeah. Then you had that second dispatch from The Atlantic magazine, which revealed that these text conversations did have timings in. They did have details of weapons. They didn't have explicit targets, yes, but the conversation was certainly not one that you'd want your top, administration officials to be having on, a Signal chat. Yeah. I think, like we've been saying all week, the easiest way to make these scandals disappear is often by offering a sacrificial lamb, someone to take the fall. Yeah. And I think the focus has landed on Pete Hegseth, the Defence Secretary, mainly because he, is a very senior member of the Trump administration. He's in charge of this massive Department of Defence with 2 million employees, but also because he was a very controversial appointment. Yeah. Anyway, a lot of people thought even before Signalgate that he was ill-equipped for the job. Former Fox News host, didn't have a history of any governmental jobs, did have a history of running some businesses, in ways that people wouldn't want to see the government being run. Sure. So a little bit of focus has landed on him. I think in the last 24 hours, the focus has switched to National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. We know from our colleagues reporting at NBC that Donald Trump is privately very frustrated with Mike Waltz, and he seems like the most likely fall guy. What I would caution is Donald Trump won't want to be seen to be giving in to the media. This is a huge story on CNN, on NBC, or on the networks that Donald Trump dislikes because he claims they have an agenda against him. He won't want to be seen to be sacking Mike Waltz just because there are demands for him to do so. Yeah.
That's why we've seen him try to tough it out as long as we have. And Hegseth is interesting, colourful character, as you say, Martha. He used to be a Fox News host. Questions about his background, financial affairs, sexual assault allegations, which he denies. Also, questions about alcohol. His response has been extremely robust, hasn't it, to trash the journalist and absolutely come out fighting. Trump, we are told, has been quite impressed by that, but how long can
that's exactly what Donald Trump would do.
Well, yes.
And has been doing.
Absolute playbook, yeah. But I suppose, maybe that works with Donald Trump. Does it work with the members of the public? Probably. The MAGA base. Swing voters, I'm not so sure, but it will not work. It will not land well with, and you alluded to it, America's allies around the world.
Yeah.
What's Britain's Defence Secretary thinking about this?
Yeah.
People who depend on this guy to guide them into conflict.
Yeah, Britain has a stake in this story, right? We share intelligence with the Americans, and we presumably don't want it being discussed on Signal group chats, and especially not with a journalist in the mix. Connor was also asking, I think, about what can Democrats do to push for accountability, change, or even resignations. Well, what they can do is take advantage of a golden opportunity here. This is the biggest chance that they've had so far to stick it to the Trump administration, something that they've failed to do so far in the first 2.5, 3 months. The likelihood of real consequences for any of the Trump administration participants in this Signal group chat is small, because essentially Democrats need Republican buy-in because, the GOP have majorities in both the House and the Senate. So, and we've heard Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson, him saying he doesn't think any additional investigation is necessary. The bulk of his caucus will follow his lead. So in terms of what they can actually do to force resignations, it's limited. But they can influence the court of public opinion, and we've already seen Democrat politicians using this scandal as a way to raise money. They've been mentioning it in fundraising emails, saying this just shows the incompetence and so on. Sure.
I think we're at the part you've all been waiting for. I'm going to ask you about Marjorie Taylor Greene, Martha, and your encounter. Sam asks, on your interaction, how do you keep your cool in such situations. I was stressed just watching it unfold, weren't we all, Sam? Jane asks, how on earth do you manage to keep your composure and respond with such professionalism? Great questions. What do you say to that, Martha?
That's very kind from Sam and Jane. I would say it's preparation, it's knowing the story and knowing the nature of the individual who you're going to encounter. It might be helpful to give a bit of background to what was going on that day. We got into the office and the second Atlantic story broke, which had details of the texts on that Signal group chat, which did seem to suggest that this was classified information. And, you know, we'd been speaking to a string of generals and former national security advisors who were saying, look, we've now looked at these texts and it very much does seem like this is classified information. And so I thought it important to put these questions to people who are at the heart of this, you know, Donald Trump movement, the Make America Great Again movement. So we headed down to the Capitol building, which, as you know, it's sort of this rabbit warren of different meeting rooms. You know, you can very easily get lost in there for hours. And we eventually landed on going to a hearing that Marjorie Taylor Greene was chairing, ironically on, trying to pull federal funding from the broadcasters, NPR and PBS. We waited outside that meeting room for a couple of hours, so had time to think about what I might say to Marjorie Taylor Greene. And she eventually came out, quick bathroom break, and never wanted to miss an opportunity to speak to the cameras. She pitched up right in front of our stakeout position. And I'd seen the way she interacts with journalists in the past. I think she told you to kiss her ass at one point.
She invited David Cameron to kiss her ass.
Oh, right, okay.
Happily. So degrees of separation there, thankfully.
But she slammed the door. She slammed the door in your face.
Yeah, well, it was about Ukraine, and Cameron had criticised Republicans
I remember that,
for supporting Russia. And that was the David Cameron can kiss my ass, slammed the door.
Yeah, and she said, I know she'd had an interaction with Emily Maitlis, rival podcaster, where she told her to F off back to your country. So, you know, she had form in not being overly polite to reporters. So I kind of steeled myself for what I thought was going to be a testy interaction. And then I think it's just a case of the fact that I'd prepared questions which were very legitimate. So when you're standing there and, you know, she's been rude to me, you know, jabbing her finger in my face, I just thought, you know, these are important questions and they're important to the international community. And, you know, I have a right to be here. I have, a visa, a press pass, and there is no rule against who can and can't ask questions. And I think it's just persistence, isn't it? If, you know, she's not answering the question the first time, you keep asking it a second, third, fourth time. And I think I was definitely helped by the fact that there was an American journalist who backed me up as well. So it's that kind of collegiate thinking around it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, it was great. And clearly, had huge impact. It's worth pointing out, I think, Martha, that, and I say this because I read it in the newspapers, the boyfriend of Marjorie Taylor Greene works for an American outlet. He's the same guy who asked Vladimir Zelensky in the Oval Office, why aren't you wearing a suit?
Yeah.
So when you look at that and think about that, that's, you know, you got Marjorie Taylor Greene, close to Trump, got Trump's ear, her boy, you know, that's the way she behaves with you. You got her boyfriend in the Oval Office. That's the way he behaves with a visiting president at war. That kind of media relationship, there's something unhealthy.
Certainly
about
questions about conflict of interest.
That merits interrogation.
Yeah, exactly. We've got a question here, James, for you from Primrose. She asks, assuming Donald Trump gets his way over Greenland, Canada, or the Panama Canal, hypothetically, how easy would it be for the next president to reverse everything? Could Donald Trump make it irreversible?
That would remain to be seen. I think if it was a Democrat president, then clearly he or she would set to work making it happen in as smooth a fashion as they could. It won't necessarily be pretty or straightforward. I don't think we can easily assume for a kickoff, actually, that Trump will get his way over Greenland, Canada, or Panama. Greenland, remember, J.D. Vance is visiting there today. It's repeatedly said it's not for sale. Canada has said it won't become the 51st state, and Panama it said it would reject any affront to their dignity as a nation. Sometimes it does feel like it's Trump way or the highway, but there are many, many roadblocks clearly to him bulldozing his way into other country. It's important to stress, I think, that territory changing hands is something, yes, that's happened many times, but it's never clean cut. And of course, there'll be all sorts of uncertainties that raise the prospect of conflict, actually. Giving territory back, we assume, could be done with the flourish of a pen if parties are in agreement. But, dealing with the consequences of acquisition, rebuilding trust, and allied relationships in a world community that has seen America seize territory against the wishes of that particular territory, that wouldn't necessarily be easy. I mean, America would become, wouldn't it, in the eyes of many, a pariah state. So resettling circumstances to the status quo as we know it now, it could get very ugly.
Certainly could.
Question for you, Martha. From P. Mitch, you've mentioned lots of executive orders. We do that on a regular basis. Mentioned that they're going to court. Which are they? Which ones are going to court?
This is a bit of a chewy subject, isn't it? Getting your head around what exactly executive orders are and if there is the power to challenge them and what exactly they mean. So first of all, at the time of recording this podcast, because it does quite literally change by the hour, Donald Trump has signed 106 executive orders, which is a record-setting amount for any president already, and we're only 70 days in to his first 100 days. So he's already way ahead of anyone who's gone before him. A reminder of what executive orders are. These are directives from the president that can be made without the approval of Congress, which is what makes them special. They're often shorter term than acts of Congress because they can be reversed very quickly by the next president. There are a few Donald Trump executive orders that have already been temporarily blocked by a judge. Those include his bid to end birthright citizenship, freezing foreign aid by shutting down USAID, suspending the refugee programme, ending federal support for gender-affirming care, and banning transgender people from serving in the military. So there is judicial pushback already to some of his executive orders. There are too many to list. I think that would make for a boring podcast, more boring than you might like. Exactly. Too many to list, but just to give you a flavour of what some of those executive orders are, to give you an idea of some of the lawsuits on Donald Trump's executive order, some non-profit groups are suing over the creation of Elon Musk's Doge, his Department of Government Efficiency. A group of environmentalists are suing to reverse an offshore drilling ban, and the National Treasury Employees Union is suing over an executive order to make it easier to fire federal employees. So those are some of the lawsuits which are challenging these Donald Trump executive orders. So there's a lot of back and forth, a lot to keep up with. And some of these challenges will go as far as the Supreme Court. Others will be settled in lower courts.
Yeah, that's going to be the big test, isn't it? The Supreme Court. That's on, so much will turn on the case as heard by America's highest court.
And this is a court that has been stacked in Donald Trump's favour.
He appointed 3 of the Supreme Court justices.
Exactly.
He's got pals on the bench.
It's conservative leaning for sure. James, we've got a question from Derek here. Derek says, Trump will clearly try to steal the next presidential election, either for himself or a family member or crony, by any means possible. Is the US Constitution robust enough to prevent this?
Yeah, thanks, Derek. The Constitution is clear. He cannot run for a third term. Nobody can, according to the 22nd Amendment. The maximum is 2 terms. That, however, isn't going to stop some of his supporters from trying to make it happen. And Donald Trump himself hasn't really ruled it out. I was at CPAC a few weeks ago at the Conservative Political Action Committee, and there was a group there, the Third Term Project, they call themselves. There was a kind of basement, all sorts of exhibition stalls, and it was like a sort of MAGA wonderland, Steve Bannon giving speeches, and it was all that stuff going on. Loads of marketing material everywhere, one of which was a kind of full-size cardboard cutout of a Roman Julius Caesar type with Donald Trump's face on it. So Try. You can't unsee that, can you?
No.
Anyway,
Scary.
so this is one group lobbying for a constitutional amendment to change things. It's being led by a Republican congressman from Texas, basically trying to extend presidential terms from 8 years to 12. So that's happening. And amending the Constitution is possible. It is, however, a long shot.
Yeah.
The options are pretty tortuous and would involve a large majority of states agreeing to it. And given where we are right now, given the division and the way the numbers stack up, that isn't going to happen soon, certainly.
Yeah.
A question from Colin for you, Martha. Why is Trump not directly challenged on his lies? Reporters seem to let him say the craziest lie without putting him immediately on the spot.
This is a curious question, Colin, because actually Donald Trump offers more access to his White House than President Biden certainly ever did. You know, he does these gaggles and he does impromptu opportunities with the press almost every day. So in theory, there is more opportunity to challenge Donald Trump than there was for the last administration. But it is a difficult White House to work within for journalists because things have changed a lot since the first time round. It was mostly rhetoric against journalists then, you know, being branded fake news. That term was coined, an enemy of the state. And of course, words are dangerous. You know, this resulted in a more hostile environment for journalists to operate in the past. But it's now sort of changed from rhetoric to action. Donald Trump promised in his election campaign that he was going to go after journalists this time round. He even threatened, you know, they'll face jail if they refuse to reveal sources. And we have seen a push to punish journalists when they go against the Trump narrative. The Federal Communications Commission, for instance, launching investigations into NPR and PBS. I mentioned earlier that was where I had my encounter with Marjorie Taylor Greene outside a hearing about pulling federal funding from what the Trump administration says are these left-wing biased organisations. We also saw the Associated Press news agency chucked out of White House briefings for refusing to call that body of water south of the United States the Gulf of America. They still call it the Gulf of Mexico. They've been chucked out of those briefings as a result of that. The president and his team favour giving interviews to more conservative outlets like Fox News. Only yesterday, Elon Musk sat down with a whole host of his Department of Government Efficiency employees, and that was in an interview with Brett Baer on Fox News. So it's difficult to challenge people when you're not there. But I would argue that there is pushback to some of what Donald Trump is saying. You often hear dissenting voices in those press conferences. Even the other day, you know, he was not answering questions on Signalgate, but you heard journalists asking repeatedly about the implications of that and what was he doing and was anyone going to take accountability. So I think there is pushback to his lies, but there is a lot of disinformation. It is very hard to challenge everything that he's saying. Yeah,
and there is the business of the answers that you get from Donald Trump. Largely, often, are meaningless, actually, and it's pure deflection. He will rubbish the reporter if it's a tough question. And of course, he will pick out journalists who he knows are going to serve him up, you know, the kind of innocent stuff. What's your favourite colour, Mr. President? I suppose in that context, though, in the press conference, the important thing is if you're not going to get relevant, appropriate answers from your subject, the president himself, it's important for the public, we the viewer, to hear the correct questions asked so that they can at least see the reaction of the person being questioned and make their own judgment as to whether they're being sold a dummy or whether or not, you know, there is a credibility in the subject of that question. You know, so I suppose for the viewer and for the people we work for, it's important we ask the right questions and they can make their own mind up on the answer that they get. Yeah.
But a difficult climate to operate on.
Sure.
Operate in at the moment. James, we've got a question from Matt Black. He asks, why has no one asked why the hell Trump is running a country like a company, because this ain't The Apprentice.
Yeah, well, you had me fooled, Matt. Often it does look like The Apprentice, doesn't it? The smouldering Donald Trump, everything bar the kind of crunching violins when you switch on the TV and he's doing his thing.
And no firings this week.
President, no, well, stick around. That may change. It's only Friday morning. But yeah, I mean, and he plays people off and places off against each other, doesn't he? And he does deals according to business principles, not necessarily the best fit for the way the world works, as he and we are maybe finding out. The idea, Matt, of running a country like a business, it's not a new one. It's not restricted to the United States. There is this conviction, pretty well established and actually popular, not just in the business community, but many people think it makes sense for a government to be run like a corporation. It's what made Donald Trump popular with CEOs and much of the public, despite the fact that his business history is checkered, to say the least. I was reading in the Wall Street Journal, they're saying that CEOs actually are becoming restless and alarmed for fear of the way it's all going. They had been expecting a low regulation, light touch approach to economic management, a new golden age. Instead, what they are witnessing is chaos, uncertainty, and plunging consumer confidence, markets tumbling, and so on. Voters, and they were expecting prices to drop. We're not seeing that yet. In fact, Trump actually has shown little interest in lowering prices since he took office. Rather, seems to be engaged in this trade policy that is expected to increase inflation. On top of that, you have large numbers of people being put out of work in the federal workforce. Lots of regions seeing big cuts, particularly low-income Republican ones that are heavily dependent on federal money. So there's nervousness all around, I think, not surprisingly, about investment, building, spending money. I suppose, briefly, or to summarize, it's the idea that a government is like a business probably doesn't get seriously questioned because so many people believe that's as it should be, and they've seen Donald Trump. They know the profile, they know the hype and the PR, and they have confidence in him. How long that lasts, of course, is the big question.
And a lot of people voted for him for that very reason, because he is a businessman. And, they say we've had politicians who don't know what they're doing. And, at least he's made his businesses successful. So why can't he apply the same techniques to this country?
Yeah.
No, more complicated than that, obviously. But,
Yeah, just a tad.
I hear.
We've reached the end, Martha. I think that's the end of our questions and the answers. Many thanks for sending in those questions. Very much appreciated. We're always grateful for your input. That brings us to a close. Do keep listening to Trump 100. Keep listening. Keep watching. Do keep sending us your questions to the email address trump100@sky.uk. That's right, isn't it?
That is. You've nailed it. Thank you very much. Look forward to answering more questions next week.
All the best.